Well, welcome everybody to this month's edition of Conclave. We have three astonishing readers who, as usual, are going to read their poetry. Then we will discuss, which will be a privilege. It always is. And then we will have a general discussion at the end. Welcome back, Sudeep. I think he may have frozen. In that case, I think it's my great honor to introduce Didi. Didi, you're reading first, aren't you? Didi is the author of Moonjar from Red Hen Press in 2020. And her poems have appeared in the New Yorker, American Poetry Review, the Kenyon Review, New England Review, and elsewhere. It's a really prestigious roll call. Jackson's poems have been selected for the Best American Poetry Series and Poem a Day by the Academy of American Poets. She lives in Nashville, Tennessee, where she teaches creative writing at Vanderbilt University. Welcome to Conclave, Didi.
Thank you. Thank you, Fiona. And thank you, Sudeep. And it's such a privilege to be reading for the Conclave reading series. And I want to thank Dawn also, and to be reading with Carol and Tina. So this is wonderful. And I'm looking forward to the discussion and talk afterwards. And I also want to do a shout out to many of my students are actually logged in here. And I wanted to say hi to them because it's 10 a.m. here. So technically we'd be in class, but we're holding class here virtually with everyone else. So I wanted to say hi to them too. So I'll just get started if that's okay. Just get right into it.
Absolutely wonderful.
The first couple poems I'll be reading will be from my collection Moonjar, and then I would read a couple from a new collection of mine called My Infinity. So let's see. Trying to get to it. Sorry. Signs for the living. Sometimes, after the last snow in May, after the red-winged blackbird clutches the spine of the cattail, after he leans forward, droops his wings, and flashes his epaulets, I imagine shouldering the yellow center lines of the road. Near the recently thawed pond, within a long channel of construction, a man holding a sign. One side says slow, the other stop. Joy and sorrow always run like parallel lines. Inside the house, when I leave the lights on, small white moths come like a collection of worship, pulsing their wings up and up the window as if in a frenzied trance-like dance. Some dervishes, others the penitent on shaky knees. The first few years after my husband's suicide, I wanted to be the penitent. I thought I deserved all the pain I could feel. The drill of roadwork in late summer was a welcome, grinding music. Now the yellow center lines are flung like braids behind me. I'm just reading the first and last poem from the collection, and the last poem is the title poem, and it's Moonjar, and it's really a poem about loving the imperfections in ourselves. So, Moonjar. My wedding ring is missing one small diamond, and I like it that way. A reminder of the imperfect in all of us, like that keyhole size of grief that remains crystalline. In Korea, ceramicists for centuries have made moon jars, testimony to the virtue of modesty, asymmetrical warping on the wheel, slumping in the pine-heated kiln, impurities when fired, black dots and pocks on its surface, like freckles on skin. I have been kept awake so many nights by the moon, its pull on the pines and night birds, and who, like a monk, keeps a sharp order of time. Never a perfect sphere, the milky moon jar joins two clay hemispheres into one. When the light of the moon finds me, I am the color of everything in the winter night. I decided to also pick a couple poems that were seasonal. That one, both with a kind of late spring going into late spring, moving into summer, and then that one with winter. And this one's titled Fall. Do you know what I was, how I lived? Louise Glick. It is a goldfinch, one of the two small girls, both daughters of a friend, sees hit the window and fall into the fern. No one hears the small thump, but she, the youngest, sees the flash of gold against the mica sky as the limp, feathered envelope crumples into the green. How many times in a life will we witness the very moment of death? She wants a box and a small towel, some kind of comfort for this soft body that barely fits in her palm. Its head rolling side to side, neck broke, eyes still wet and black as seed. Her sister, now at her side, wears a dress too thin for the season, white as the winter only weeks away. She wants me to help, wants a miracle. Whatever I say now, I know weighs more than a late fall's layered sky, the jeweled leaves of the maple and elm. I know too, in its darkest days, I've learned to praise. The calendar packages up time. The days shrink and fold away until the new season. We clothe, burn, then bury our dead. I know this, they do not. So we cover the bird, story its flight, imagine his beak singing. They pick the song and sing it over and over again.
Beautiful.
Thank you. I'm also trying to keep track of time. The next poem is my attempt at a little lightness, which doesn't always find its way into my work. And the title is a quote by Frank Stella, a visual artist. What you see is what you see. Frank Stella would be proud of my migraines, especially those that come after sex, exquisite pleasure, then blindness, the hard-edged jagged lines with day glow colors that grow into a barbed crescent, eating at one side of my head till it passes like a lit up road sign, paracentral, mid-peripheral, far peripheral, gone. Then, sorry, I have a puppy in the room with me. Then the Veery picks up the flute outside my window, and I can hear every tiny whirl inside the metal pipe of its throat. A song some in the 19th century called seductive. And finally, I can find my clothes and smell the ground coffee we made hours ago. Sheets pungent with sweat, the rain a few miles away. Under this geometric spell, the pills like wasps beneath my tongue. I am the closest to my true self, and I secretly love the agony, just as I love the blue webbing of veins on my legs, wrinkles like tidal ripples on my face. I know that the pain will come and eventually go. The birches grow still before the storm, like they want to hear us, like they are voyeurs listening in to both kinds of my ecstasy. And this is a really new poem I'm going to read. I'd like to read something that's like really, really fresh. And this is something I wrote just a month or two ago this summer while we were in Greece. And I had the luxury of and the pleasure and privilege of being able to enter into this cathedral alone. And I was in the entire space by myself, and it was really magical and beautiful. And so it was from in this little town, Vombako, in the Peloponnese in Greece. And the church is named after the saint Halabos. So, and it's titled Glowing with Joy, and Glowing with Joy is his name translated. So Halamos is translated to Glowing with Joy. And I have an epigraph by Fernando Pessoa that says, I bear the wounds of all the battles I avoided. I pause and light a candle as I enter Saint Halabos, whisper a small prayer, something that might match the smell of incense and stillness. I'm alone in this church, so I sit in the nave, under the dome, under hundreds of eyes, the bodies frozen in moments of wonder or awe or torture or merely life on each inch of the walls. Outside, the wind rips against the marble, but the Theotokos sits still as a cat in the apse above the altar, her baby with one arm raised, like lifting a tiny flag, as two angels with arched backs flank the pair, their bodies manifesting the questions we all have. So how do we endure this suffering? Halabos played alive, thanking his torturers for scraping off his old body and renewing his soul. And though this saint can protect from the plague, the walls here are spotted with mold, already eating at the gowns and the stiff floating bodies, the paint peeling like small wounds. And since I'm alone, I consider these wounds, spores lodged inside us. This is when I can't see the whole, only cell next to cell next to cell, like the row of images on the iconostasis, each their own story of suffering, so specific, part of all suffering. Why we remember the decapitated heads, the severed arms, saints who lost their eyes, their breasts, their tongues. What is our suffering then? The voices of workers at midday break filter in with the clerestory's light, and they take a beer or two in the nearby cafe, and the swallow still glides like a blessing under the groin vault of the portico, her baby's calling with gurgles, liquid and joyful. And I'll end on one short poem, tiny poem titled Mercy. And it was my attempt at getting a ghost in a poem, Mercy. I prefer the charred smell of old fire rings, tattooed evidence of laughter, like the kingfisher's rattle at the water's edge, the shoreline, the pallor of my skin. Who am I to be witness to the infinite number of jays winging down the mountain, blue beads weaving in and out of pine and beech, jeweled and brilliant? The air itself is memory. There is no freedom like that. The mountains are multiple continents. How do I pray to anything larger than this? Everything is of me and so much greater than me. And why quit this place? Birch branches softly drum my name. And when I say quit, I mean intentionally, as with blades or guns, pills even. Miracles fall everywhere like loose leaves. A ghost rests in my arms and I rock him for a moment as he remembers what was good, the cool nights, the warmth of campfires, the mercy that strips us naked to each other. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So just so wonderful to hear this. You were talking about there's very little humor in your poetry, but there's quite a lot of a sort of angular humor, wit in a sense. Is it very difficult for you to write humorous poems? Is it something that is, because poets, I know for a fact that it's, we all tend to take ourselves so seriously and we write super seriously. And so the laughing aspect of it is difficult, but is it a difficult thing for you?
I think so. And then sometimes, I mean, I think I'm a funny person, I think I make jokes a lot in my regular life, but when I go to write my work, it tends to be pretty serious. And so I'm always excited when I have something that's a little lighter and playful. the subject matter of Moonjar is just very serious, and that was just the nature of the book and the nature of my own life experiences that led to that book. But I do want to think about myself. I don't want to think myself as always serious. So that's why I wanted to read something that was a little less, you know, heavy, particularly. I mean, migraines also are pain, but I've learned to manage and also deal with and understand kind of the things that kind of go around migraine. And anyway, yeah.
You have this lovely mixture, I think. You've got this wonderful sort of range. I mean, the migraine poem is such a great example of that, pleasure and pain intertwined, and that, but holding them together in one sensibility and one poetic voice is just wonderful. I think too, I was really thinking when you were kind of apologizing for not being funny all the time, I was thinking how hard it is, I think, for women writers, for women poets in particular, to assume the serious posture. It's very easy for us to deprecate and make jokes, and we do it all the time in conversation, don't we? All that phatic communication, which is kind of, oh, little me, I'm much less threatening than you think I am. But to step up to seriousness and ask the reader, the listener, to step up with us is really hard, I think. And you just do it so beautifully. I wasn't surprised you had a epigraph from Louise Gluck, that sense. I thought that was a shared sensibility almost. Don't know if you wanted to talk a bit about seriousness and, you know, how difficult it can be.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona, for saying that, actually. And I feel, you know, I first started reading any of my poems out loud, particularly poems from Moonjar. I felt compelled to apologize for the poems themselves before I even read them. And sometimes I still feel like I need to at least give a warning of what might be coming. And that's just by the nature of the subject matter, and that, you know, if someone's not familiar with my work, they might ever have not read it ahead of time. So I had that inclination early on. And it's true, I fight it. And I have learned through support from people who I love and responses to my readings to kind of fight that inclination and to understand that, you know, we too can claim these spaces that are of seriousness and things that are important to be speaking about in the world without apology. Yeah, so
that lovely undertow you have of ecstatic witness, that kind of, you know, the yellow lines that become braid you throw over your shoulder. That's a very special note, I think.
Yeah, and in fact, you know, it's interesting that Fiona, that you bring up the point of gender, because when I read Didi's poems, you know, I didn't even realize it was a woman or a man writing, because the poems themselves are just so strong, and the articulation through phrase making is so strong. I mean, if you take a poem which you just read, Glowing with Joy, that juxtaposed with the Pessoa epigraph, I bear the wounds of all battles I avoided. It's a clear case of, you know, you're playing with both the yin and the yang, the dark and the light, but the focus is joy in a sense. And it's ungendered, which is what the strength of the poem is to me. Is it something that you consciously use as a ploy, or comes naturally to you?
I don't think I'm consciously, I think that might just be like, again, natural, something naturally that I'm doing. But I am consciously thinking about finding, I don't know if this is my mission necessarily, but finding joy in the everyday, or finding joy in the darkness. I mean, that's the nature of life, right? I mean, the nature of life is that. I mean, I even tell my students this, that, you know, in moments of pain and suffering, if we just hold on a little longer, there will be moments of joy that will come. And then in moments of joy, the really sad part of this is that in moments of joy, it's not too long before something that's painful and some moment of suffering will be kind of coming along the road for us. So it's that. And so I do tend to like to write about where that balance kind of comes into play. And I found myself doing that in Moonjar, particularly because I wanted to write about the experience of me losing my second husband to suicide. But I also didn't want that to be the only thing that my life was about, and his life was about, really. I mean, there was more to life, both of our lives, still for mine, but even to his beyond that. And so that's why I think I focus, even like the way the book moves is, you know, it's the experience and this kind of rebirth and then this kind of like afterlife, if you will. So yeah.
I wonder whether your great sort of poetic gift actually, well, one of them is measure. You know, you show us one thing and you show us the next. Actually, you do it when you're talking as well. Yes, it's lovely to hear that.
Oh, good. So it plays out here and then into my work as well. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, I think the line would be under this geometric spell and pills like wasp beneath my tongue. Brilliant, brilliant. Well, thank you, Didi. We'll come back
Thank
to you
you so
again.
much, Didi.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Fantastic, fabulous. We'll follow the order of the posters. So now it's going to be Tina Chang. It's great to see you, Tina, after, I don't know, 20 years maybe.
Oh my goodness, thank you.
I have a first book which was published in 2004, I think, yeah. So let me just read out the bio because it's, I'll also put it up here again. Tina Chang was born in Oklahoma to Chinese immigrants. Chang attended Binghamton University and received her MFA in poetry from Columbia University. She is the author of Hybrida, which was published by Norton in 2019, of Gods and Strangers, which is 4-way books in 2011, and Half-Lit Houses, which I just showed you, which came out in 2004, which was also the finalist for the Asian American Literary Award from the Asian American Writers Workshop. Chang is the co-editor with Natalie Handel, who will be on our show later on, and Ravi Shankar, who's been on another program, of this brilliant, brilliant anthology called Language for a New Century, Contemporary Poets from the Middle East,
So
Asia,
wonderful, indispensable.
and yes, big fat Bible. The first Bible which is worth its religious weight. There are very few international anthologies that exist, and I think this was a really path-breaking one. Chang has held residencies at the MacDowell Colony, the Jurassic Arts Residency, Vermont Studio Center, and many others. She's also received awards from Barbara Deming Memorial Fund, New York Foundation of the Arts, Poets and Writers, and elsewhere. She was elected Brooklyn Poet Laureate in 2010, where she lives. Tina, a very, very warm welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sudeep. It's so nice to see you again after all of these years. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Don. And it's such a pleasure to be reading with Didi and Carol. One of the things that I just wanted to note that is so special about this is I've never seen a reading series actually place the poems in the chat box. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Number one, because it makes it much more inclusive for anyone who can't hear that well. And it's just really nice to read the poems. And just from a totally geeky craft perspective, I loved seeing Didi's line breaks, the enjambments, the commas, like I love everything like that. So good luck with mine, because I think that some of mine almost appear as paragraphs sometimes. So this is a very sort of mixed genre book for me, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. I'm showing you the cover only because this is my newest collection, and in many ways, it was a collaboration between my young son and I. So the year, I'm actually no longer Brooklyn Poet Laureate because I moved upstate to be a director of the Binghamton University Creative Writing Program. So I moved upstate, but when I was elected the Brooklyn Poet Laureate, I also had my son at the same time. So this was about 12 years ago. And what was really interesting about that experience is I started to fear a lot the moment that I gave birth to him. He is half Chinese American. He's also half Haitian American, and being half Black, I thought about all the dangers that were waiting out in the world for him. Because either around that time or since that time, I was just thinking about the lives of Michael Brown and Eric Garner, and then since then, Elijah McClain and Tamir Rice and Antoine Rose, and most recently, George Floyd, Black men and Black boys whose lives are in danger all the time. And then those dangers are very real. So I think that for a long time creatively, I kept those ideas to myself. I didn't really know, number one, if I had the right to write about such issues. But then as I was raising my son, the voice and just the push of the creative spirit kept pushing me forward to want to write something. So I spent so many years resisting that I decided not to resist writing the poems anymore. So I will read to you from this collection that I wrote. And the first poem is called Milk. And a lot of this focuses on the lives of young boys. This one in particular focuses on the life of Leiby Kletzky. And he was an 8-year-old Hasidic Jewish boy who lived in Brooklyn, New York. And his story was very well known at the time. In 2011, he asked his parents if he could walk home by himself at the age of 8 years old. They said, of course, he's too young. In New York City, you can't do it. And he kept insisting that he could do it. And so when they sort of went through the path with him, he got it. But then on the day that he left school, instead of turning left, he turned right, he got lost. He asked a stranger for directions and he never made it home alive. So this story haunted me for a very long time. And I did not want to write about his death. That wasn't where I wanted my interest to be and the force to be. So I wrote this poem called Milk. There is an epigraph, and it's from one of my children's favorite book called In the Night Kitchen by Maurice Sendak. And there's a quote from it that goes, milk in the batter, we bake cake and nothing's the matter. In every definition of home, my son conjures milk, the sun as milk. Milk spills through open doorways, bed of warm milk, face of milk, milk trousers. A milky light passes through the lens of my camera. All of his young life, my son thought of milk, and he asked for it each night. In every memory I have of him, his hands are outstretched, and he's asking for his last bottle. In every version of a life, I never refuse him. On the television, the nation listens to the story of Leiby Kletzky. Today, I think of his mother who waited for him, allowing him for the first time to walk home alone. That morning, he held a key, heavy and shining, made especially for him. In the ancient story of boys, he headed up the street past the lone dog, barking near the fire hydrant, past the circle of children careening into their own shadows. In the ancient story of boys, he walked through his front door, and this was his rite of passage. He placed his book bag on the coffee table, and the boy and the mother sat together in the large reading chair in the living room light. But this version isn't true. Tonight, I hold my son closer. As I put on his night clothes, I'm afraid of the world. I find all the stories horrifying. In the book of nursery rhymes, the old woman sends her son to bed without food. A king beats a knave for stealing pies. And the dog cannot find his bone, though he runs in circles day after day. Perhaps if I rewrite all the old stories, a new era will begin. Era of the forgiven, era of redemption, era of safekeeping. Tonight, milk stains my blouse, a love so deep it runs for me. After all the old stories are finished, my son says, the story again. I open the book, the owls lift from the pages, and the lake is a bowl of night milk. In this, a place so safe, we are weightless, buoyant in its murky sweetness, free from a promise that each new day startles us alive.
Woo.
Oh, thank you. So nice, Sudeep. Thank you. So
Thank you.
that poem actually came out of a lot of personal resistance. That poem was probably somehow, it just felt like it was captured, like I wouldn't let that poem out. because I did not want to focus on the death of a young boy. It wasn't something that felt very life-giving to me, and my attitudes toward art were always such that they had to be life-giving. But I realized that there was something life-giving about the conversation that surrounded it, that so much of these thoughts and these feelings that not just mothers, but parents do have. And by the way, for college students that are watching, to know that parents feel so deeply and so much for their children that really the greatest fear is to lose the thing that you value the most. And that was really the charge behind the book, was to bring that out into the open, to have a conversation that the thoughts of a parent or a mother or any sort of caregiver, they're ones in which that there's all this friction happening at the same time. There's love, and on the other side of it, there's tremendous pain. And there's joy, and then there's grief. So there's all of that sort of pressing up against each other in the same space. This one sort of goes back a little bit in history, thinking a lot more about my son's actual history, how he came to be. I was asked by the poet Brian Turner to write a short essay. He asked a group of poets to write essays. But really the topic was a kiss. So he said, write about your most memorable kiss. And I said, I can't do it because anything that I write will just come out completely saccharine, and I can't do it. And then he actually showed me pieces by Major Jackson. He showed me a piece by himself, and they were just all so beautiful and touching that I just couldn't do it even more. And so I love Brian Turner because he kept insisting that I could do it. So I thought about my most memorable kiss. And of course, it was the first kiss from my son. Revolutionary kiss.
Major Jackson is in the house.
Major Jackson. So of course, someone I admire deeply. I read his piece, which was just so moving, that I just, that feeling when you read something so good, you just want to give up. That's how I felt. Although I know that that's not the sense and the feeling from any writer. I mean, their hope is that you read something and it's life-giving. It keeps moving you forward. So eventually, Major, if you're watching, I did get to that place after I thought about your piece and Brian's piece from that book. And by the way, it's such a beautiful anthology. By the way, it's called The Kiss. So if you, before we were talking about things that are cheerful and light, not all of them are cheerful and light. A lot of them are incredibly sad. If we think about our favorite kisses, some of them are first kiss, but also last kiss, which is what Brian Turner focused on, is the last kiss that he ever offered his wife who passed away. So you can imagine what I was sort of up against, but I don't think that writers should think that way. Writers should feel that they are part of a community, a tribe of people who are mutually supportive of them. So this is called Revolutionary Kiss. I had never created man before, so I invented my son first as a dream body. In order to create the dream body, I must first believe in the force of opposites, a terrible tension of what has existed and the struggle yet to come. And it is true that I had a notion of him, and for many years, for generations, my imagination traveled in search of him. It seems unlikely that a kiss would have its roots in the Haitian Revolution. Over a century ago, an uprising of hundreds of thousands of slaves freed themselves from chain and rope, from whip and guillotine, from bondage through the struggle of blood. They fought for 13 years in a revolution to stand on the shores of their own land, newly named Haiti, as free people. And they kissed the ground, however damp, with the blood of their mothers, fathers, brothers, and sons. Slaves, newly liberated, whispered my son's name, his body envisioned there, beneath the rust of shackles, beside shards of slave owners' homes, rising with the smoke from burned plantations, past the pinnacle of scoured light, past the canopy of trees dripping with the uprising of future leaves, my son begins his journey to me. Once there was a chain of kisses as my mother said goodbye to her brothers and sisters lined in a row as she left Taiwan for America. A shock of lace around her neck as she waved to a country of ghosts. Her history was equally as complex. She left China in 1949 before communists led by Chairman Mao took over mainland China. My mother crowded into a boat that would take her to the coast of Taiwan, known as the Beautiful Island, which she would one day yearn to leave. By foot, by boat, by train, by bus, by plane. It seems impossible these two histories intertwine so that one day I may find a dream body housed inside mine. All along, I wring my hands and worry, will I know how to mother him? What language will I speak? What will my mother utter once she discovers the detour of my ancestry? Will she abandon me, turn the portraits of my ancestors toward the wall, backs directed away from my longing? When I wake, the doctor's voice was muffled and thick. My mind moved in syncopated pulses, and I pushed until all the energy drained and my body cracked open. Liquid gold rushed away, finally, and now. He arrived, a purpled creature, violet and squirming, face crushed into an emperor's expression. Born from the urgency of immigrants, how futile all my years of worrying. I should have known that my boy would row his small boat to me, regardless of the sky above that shook down its lightning. And even if the ground were bruised and famished of fruit and even freedom, he would continue on as if a force were lulling him to bedrock. Right here, between his eyebrows, there is a swell of light, a country where I belong, no longer a stranger to my own skin. My mouth to his temple, and alarm cries. Tanks roll through the tail squeaking, turning their heavy wheels. When I kiss him, history's weapon falls from my pockets, shields cast beneath atelier trees. I will now end my days of resistance, my lips searching the entirety of his dream face, made mortal, my lost shadows now migrating in unison. So thank you, Sudeep. Thank you so much. Just in terms of the interest of time, because I do just really want to be fair to everybody, I'm going to skip over my last poem that I was going to read and just kind of end with showing you. So I showed you the front, which was my son's. Nobody tells you that when you have a book that you have to fight for the cover. So I sort of, but Norton's so wonderful. I don't know how much I really had to fight, but I had to highly suggest it that my son in some way should be on the cover. So that is a silhouette of him. I placed him sort of against the wall. My daughter shut off the lights and I traced the outline of his face. And that was him. So I just thought it would be appropriate to, once the book was finished, he said, Mom, I don't think that the book is really finished. And I said, why? And he said, well, because there's no poem by me. So I feel like you're writing about me, but there's no poem by me. So I'm just going to read this really short thing. So this is a little something that he wrote that's kind of like a little surprise. It's called Roman's Epilogue at the end. So you'll see he's really into graphic novels. So there's eye recognition where a boy has to sort of put his eye to get into the secret room. He enters into the secret room. He takes off all of his skin and then he goes out into the world and asks, who am I? So what he wrote was, and this is not anywhere, it's not going to be projected. He says, I come back in the secret room, slip into a skin and walk out, blended in with the world. That was his poem. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tina.
Thank you.
Marvelous, marvelous, really. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for completely changing the pace of our session this afternoon too. Now we have a different kind of measure, this kind of precipitation into the darkness of the world, which Didi talked about as well, but in such different terms. Maybe you would like to tell us something about darkness and light and joy and fear as well, that paradox.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was about the whole process of writing the book, the resistance at the very beginning of writing it. I sort of feeling that, especially as a mother, shouldn't I be life-giving? Aren't I life-giving? And I think that I realized that to talk about darkness And to talk about pain wasn't diminishing any of the light or any of the love. In fact, it was actually deepening of a love that I felt. And I loved your question to Didi, because writing this book sometimes felt very, very heavy, that I had to ask myself, what were the sources of play? So the sources of play actually came about for me in terms of how I wrote the book. So this is source of play for me. So I have a lot of paintings, and I collaborated. That's play for me. Look at this, how cool this is. Like, even talking about it with my editor, how am I going to make this process feel like interacting with these visual artists that are making these work that do reflect on the Black experience, that I also thought that they would completely reject me. Like, what, Asian American woman, why are you coming up to me asking me about my art? But the world is so surprising because they wound up wanting to collaborate with me. So these are some of the world's most famous artists, like Kehinde Wiley, whose painting I first showed, who reflects a lot on the Black experience in making these sort of old masters paintings, like Napoleon crossing over the Alps. Like, he made that painting into a Black painting where a Black male is centered in the painting instead of Napoleon. And so I found his conversations just so incredibly fascinating. So that then became the source of light and fun for me. I think also just collaborating with my editors on, like, if you see there's these little stars, like there's these stars and these codes, like that made it super fun for me to be able to do that, to ask myself, well, how, when we're poets, we talk about form and function all the time, form and function, form and function. So the function of the book felt so weighted. There were definitely moments where I felt like I couldn't even get up to write the book because it felt so weighted to me to think about the lives of Tamir Rice and Michael Brown and Eric Garner. Just made me feel so furious that they were no longer here in the world. And then I was writing poems, like almost letters toward them, that this kind of the form then helped me, writing ekphrastic poems, writing poems with stars and codes and paintings, and talking to photographers and painters made it lighter for me, made it so enjoyable for me to write. That pathway felt really just collaborative, bright, shiny, and that's what sort of kept me going in the 10 years that it took me to write the book.
And a fascinating sort of process too, that you weren't, it's not then that you gave a complete manuscript to Norton and said, how shall we frame this? It's that you really worked with them, and you worked with all these artists.
Well, Jill Bilasky, who, I think Majors probably worked with Jill too. She's brilliant.
Yeah.
She's brilliant.
Norton too. Yeah.
Oh, you do. So she came to me with all of these ideas. Well, why don't you make the anchoring poem completely by itself in one section? And these are wonderful things to talk about. How am I going to orchestrate this book so that it tells this complete story? And she was wonderful like that. And that's the collaborative process between, you're right. I didn't present one whole manuscript like this is the way I exactly want it. I wasn't that rigid in that process. I really delivered it to her like, I'm unsure about certain things. Tell me what you think. I'd love for you to hold up a mirror to the book and let me know, how should I walk through this? Because I've been, as many writers know, I've been so in my head, and this is the beautiful thing about workshop poetry or creative writing workshop, you bring it out into the open. And if you're in a great creative writing workshop, the process is very open. Instead of feeling very down after a workshop, like I should never write again, you feel like, yes, this is why I chose this path. I want to be a writer because I get to collaborate in this way.
That's a really joyous continuity with the teaching life that we're all involved in too. That's a wonderful thing to say. Thank you, Tina. And so then, does that mean that this work, which obviously I realized it was 2019, so it's start of pandemic, isn't it? Which must have affected the life of the book in terms of, because what I was going to ask was, has it had a life outside the pages? Has it been an exhibition? Has it been an installation? Have you done performance around it? as
Yeah,
well
I
as
was,
the
I
conventional
was
reading?
really
Oh,
lucky. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because I was really lucky that when the book first came out, the hardcover version of the book, that I had already been on it felt like a whirlwind tour and I was actually very ready to sit down and just start working on new material again. I had really been through, it's like I say the ringer, but it's also just such a joy to meet audience members who read the work. And they're like, wow, there are real people who read my work and they'll turn the pages and everything. So that was just completely enjoyable. And then by the time COVID hit, it was starting to calm down a little bit, but then I had then I had a different kind of relationship with readers where it became a much more intimate experience. Like, how often do we get to sort of sit in this quiet space and they'll actually be able to ask me a question where I could see them, so I could see their pores. You know, I could see them face to face, and that was a different kind of relationship. So that was beautiful.
And
Tina,
one last question, I guess.
Sorry, go ahead.
One last question, I guess, was what does your son make of it?
I think he's still trying to understand, like, I mean, he's really still, I mean, everything that happened with George Floyd, to see his own level by the time, I mean, he's 12 years old now. So to be able to process his rage, I think will be a very different experience for him to process his own rage as a Black boy is very different from me processing the rage as a mother watching him. So I think that I'm sorry, Sudeep, what
How
12.
old is he?
He's 12 now. So he was growing up as I was writing the book. So he was a little too young. So it was that was also a concern of mine, is that I made sure that I wrote the book from my perspective, not his perspective, that it was really, as with any parent, they're both a part of you and completely apart from you. And I told him actually that one of the jobs that I have as a caregiver, anybody who's not a mother or father, caregiver, is that I'm teaching you how to live in the world without me. But I realized that as I said that, I actually was doing the same thing. I have to learn how to live in the world eventually without him as well. So that came in many different forms, a sort of envisioning of something happening to him, and also realistically, like him being that independent person moving on without me and me being fine, which I'm working on right now.
Tina, this is interesting because you speak very, very eloquently about your poetry, almost as if, you know, it's a parallel chapter. You've been let loose here and you've been speaking about your poetry in a way which is an equal mirrored performance in prose. But that apart, I want to take you back to your very, very first writings, which you haven't lost those essential metaphor of whiteness, light, paleness, darkness. Is very, very much present even in the poems we were reading today. I want you to address, and you've already done that partly, but I want you to address not just the idea of whiteness or the idea of blackness, but with your ethnic space, specifically the Asian space, which is unique in America because it's kind of like a subset which partly gets talked about, but very much, I think when you see it globally, is marginalized. It's in the margins in many ways. And you contend with the Asianness, and Asianness is a problematic thing because, you know, you've got Chinese origin, I've got Indian, we have nothing in common, but at the same time, it's Oriental in some ways. How do you place the idea of Oriental metaphors and history and blood within the American context of poetry and literature?
Well, I think I tried to contend with that a lot in my second book of Gods and Strangers. And it's very hard because I think that in this book, one of the greater, I wouldn't say criticisms, but conversations was sort of like, well, where is the Asian American side in this particular book? And I think that in the last piece that I wrote, I did contend with that a lot because a lot of the difficulties that I think that I tried to contend with is, and it was like a piece that I wrote for the New York Times that actually led up to the book. It was almost the story of my Asian American family and how they coped or didn't cope very well with my new family. And I think I think that oftentimes, to answer your question, in the Asian American realm, especially in Asian America, because when we were traveling all through Asia for the anthology that you held up, a lot of readers came up to me and said, "Oh, you have sort of a mixed identity syndrome that we don't have here in Asia." I said, "What do you mean?" They said, "Well, all of our friends that we meet in America, they're so confounded by their own sense of self, whereas we don't have that here in Asia." And I have to say that is the truth, but also something that becomes, and you can answer to this from your perspective, also something that I have seen here in America is that I then have to become a representative voice for Asian Americans. And that, I think, is difficult for me. I think that there are moments that I have tried to sort of take that role, but then I very quickly step back from it, knowing that my specific story is very, very uncommon from the rest of Asian America, so those types of things are very difficult to walk through as a writer. I would say that in the second book, I did try to cope and deal with that a lot more than this one. But then this book, I think, dealt with the difficulties of being Asian American, having a son who is half Black, and then dealing with, I think especially in the New York Times piece that I wrote, inherent racism in Asian and Asian American culture, something that I don't actually think is talked about all that often. So I think that what happens with a book is it starts conversations. They're beginnings of conversations, and I hope that they continue over the course of either subsequent books that I write or conversations that I have with live audience members. So I think that that's the path that I choose to take.
Yeah, it's hybrid A. You started the A and you're going to continue with all the letters, I suppose.
All the Z's. I have to get to the Z by the end of my life. Like, what does that look like? Once I hit 96, what is the hybrid conversation then? It'll be so much more advanced. We'll be talking in will we be robots? Will we be hybrid creative robots? I don't know, but all of that is fascinating to me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, conversations with you and Didi, and of course with Carol again, it can be endless because it's just the depth and richness of all your work is just so infinite and profound. So thank you very much, Tina. And we'll get back to you. And finally, we have Carol Moldaw, I've read all her work, thanks. Because partly we've kept in touch, and I've read all her husband's work too, another brilliant poet. Yeah, there's at least two of you have husband-wife poet combinations. So Didi Jackson and Major Jackson, and Carol and Arthur Z, who's in the house too. So welcome, Carol. I'm going to read out your bio formally. Carol Moldaw is the author of Beauty Refracted, which came out in 2018, as well as 5 other books of poetry, including The Lightning Field, which won the Field Poetry Prize, and a novel, The Widening, which was published by Instruction Press in 2008. Her work has been published widely in journals, including the New York Review of Books, Poem a Day, Agni, Denver Quarterly, Field, Harvard Review, the New Yorker, the Yale Review, Plume, and On the Seawall, which is a very, very interesting site run by a poet, which also published an interview with her in 2020. She lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Carol, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sudeep. Thank you. I want to thank both you, Sudeep, and you, Fiona, for first having this extraordinary series and then including me, and Don for his support, which I turned out to need, and technical support. And it's such a pleasure to read with Didi and Tina, whose work both I admire both of them, and I love how distinct I think we all are, despite all being on this side of the Atlantic, and I'm in New Mexico. So I decided to read all new work. I'm just going to flash my last book since I'm not reading from it, Beauty Refracted. But this first poem is called Meditation on the Veranda. Bliss right now, beneath the blue jade vine's beaded bangs, my sonar function asleep, the eye unstressed, a syllable glided over. Except wherever in the line it's placed, the eye is stressed. Behind me, a lipstick palm. In front of me, the early stages of sunrise, the world before highlighters applied. Scavengers. One by one, 6 or 7 ravens settle on the polished rim of our front courtyard's bowl-cut stone fountain. They cool their claws in the overflow, pecking at the placid water, a hint of gurgle at its center. From inside the window, I can see them convening, conversing, but can't see why a flock is called an unkindness. To get at that, I'd have to be out in the field among the carrion. When they leave, they lift off in one great rustle snap. You can see I don't say much between most poems. Richter scale. If this were a crowdsourced blueprint for the resistance, it would tell you what action to take, but it won't, it can't, isn't, I'm afraid, built that way. It wants instead to daydream, to remember a sunset when a bevy of deer vogued in the meadow, all looking up at the same time while grazing, all 5 tilting their heads at the same angle, their tails held up like rattles about to twitch. I scroll news the way my father followed stocks, sensitive to the smallest tremor. A seismograph, a lie detector needle, my pen, its doodles on the scratch pad. In slow motion, who can tell which way things will fall? History in real time. The deer scatter when I blink. Well, this poem is for Arthur, and it's called Raccoons. On my way to water the strawberries at dusk, I gardened in those days. I saw a raccoon clasping the outdoor spigot like a sailor's wheel, using both paws that seemed more and more like hands as it kept twisting until water gushed out of the copper nozzle and it drank. I hadn't thought of it in years, not even after I saw another raccoon high-stepping the coyote fence midday with a limp vole overhanging its mouth. Such a singular sight, I had to tell you, and blurted it out as soon as I saw you, a piece of domestic gossip, like the first crocus or noisy neighbors. Common property, like so much in marriage. A small business, a friend called it, down to the cooked books. Only later, after I spotted the raccoon sauntering through a line in one of your poems, only after the pressure cooker of my displeasure caused you to recast your raccoon and vole as skunk and mole, did I flash on the one I'd seen decades before. Its lack of furtiveness, the air it had of being within its rights, the way it took its time to retrace its steps to turn the water off. Or did it amble on and let the water run? No copyright protects idle talk, you might have said. Or the imaginarium of marriage knows no bounds.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
This next poem I wrote when I started, learning, reading, and seeing images on TV about the family separation at the US-Mexico border, and it's called Olmec. The bone-crushing pain of turning into a jaguar, palpable in the shaman's cleft head carved in basalt or jade, in his downturned, squared off open mouth, lips stretched and dilated in birthing in a scream. Try to imagine yourself crossing from one world of pain into another, the quiet needed to summon the fury needed to catapult you over. For the umpteenth time, until entranced, I trace a talismanic cascade of curlicues copied from an old book. Images smuggled out from the border, TV loops stream even my closed eyes. In no other world but this, we watch as mother is again and again torn from child, no glyph known for repair. Arthritis. Save your hands, my mother says, seeing me untwist a jar's tight cap, just the way she used to tell me not to let boys fool around or feel my breasts, keep them fresh for marriage, as if they were a pair of actual fruit. I scoffed to think they could bruise, scuff, soften, rot, wither. I look down now at my knuckly thumbs, my index finger permanently askew in the same classic crook as hers, called a swan's neck, as if snapped, it's that pronounced. Even as I type, wondering how long I'll be able to, each joint in my left hand needing to be hoisted, prodded into place, one knuckle like a clock style clicking as it's turned to open, bend or unbend. I balk at the idea that we can overuse ourselves, must parcel out and pace our energies so as not to run out of any necessary component while still alive. The definition of necessary, necessarily suffering change over time. The only certainty is uncertainty, I thought I knew, so ignored whatever she said about boys and sex, her version of a story, never mine. It made me laugh, the way she made up traditions, that we didn't kiss boys until a certain age, we didn't fool around. What we? What part of me was she? No part I could put my finger on. How odd then, one day, to find her half napping in her room, talking first to herself and then to me about a boy she used to know, her friend's brother, who she kissed, she said, just because he wanted her to. Now, why would I do that, she mused, distraught anew and so freshly stung by the self-betrayal. I reached across the gulf my father left to her side of their bed and stroked my future hand. On the cusp. Don't forget me, she pleads, just as she's quavering on the cusp of forgetting me. She utters my birth time, our shared moment of severing, my zodiacal starting point, like a secret code, a charm, the combination needed to open her built-in wall safe. The gears grind. When she gets the time wrong, I correct her, though I know I shouldn't. She wants her daily horoscope read aloud. Cancer, our mutual birth sign. What she says she did wrong doesn't match what I think, but I let it all go. She did nothing wrong. Look how we turned out. Aren't we your proof? Don't forget me, she repeats. 909. Radical acceptance. Yes, I say back, affirming that I too should cherish our recent heart-to-heart, although I suspect the reference is to a talk we never had. It doesn't matter to me that our hallowed conversation is supposed. It's meaningful enough to stand in for other talks we didn't have or botched. I'm not a word person, she often said, usually in response to my questioning whether some phrase I thought misused expressed quite what she intended to say. That we were at odds over issues of speech aggravated, aggrieved, I think, us both, until the truce-like terms her brain imposed. I'm going to read two more poems. This poem reflects kind of a convergence of difficulties, the pandemic and the increasingly restricted access in the US to abortion. It's called Road Trip. It rained overnight, refreshing the earth. The air wasn't yet warm, the leaves not fully unfurled. It was the height of the virus, the first wave. With clinics in 7 states closed and ours booked, we found one within a day's round trip. I hadn't driven in weeks, for days hadn't been past the bottom of our drive to pick up the paper at 6 and the mail at 1. We got a doctor's note in case the state's border was sealed. Quote, unable to schedule time-sensitive procedure in state, please allow through. No one stopped us and we made good time. Only one hazmat-suited protester outside the 2-block buffer zone shouldered a sign stapled to a plywood cross that proclaimed a woman's regret inevitable. I kept both hands tight on the wheel so as not to flip him off as we drove by. In the parking lot, the cars were spaced for social distance. The appointment mostly by phone, each car a semi-private glass-sealed intake room. I had to pee. What could I do? I got out and stooped behind a lone thin pine. At intervals, the door opened to let someone in or out. Up and down the path, everyone wore a mask, but with no legal necessity, not yet, to hide. And then I started with a meditation. I'm going to end with its partner, meditation in the open air garage. Leaves have no choice but to articulate the wind. Aspens like zills, a glint and a tilt, the willow, a lone zither. Riffling the cottonwoods at dusk, winds find me cushioned against the concrete in the open air garage, facing the trees, the drive, the road, the mountains up the canyon's other side, until an onrush bellows, a mindless, heartless ecstasy through the empty sack of me. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Particularly absolutely loved that whole sequence of, you know, yourself and your life stacked inside your mother, you know, your stacked identities.
That's a nice way to put it.
And then I guess in the other direction too, in the drive to the clinic, that's a different generation in the opposite direction. And
Right.
yeah, just those questions of identity and mirroring, which Tina was also talking about, in a sense, difference very much when she's talking about her son. And you're talking about, you know, that it's like the Thomas Hardy poem in The Family Face, isn't it? You know, I persist through the generations, you know, your mum's arthritis persists through the generations. And that terrific tenderness about the cusp when someone is disappearing into confusion, but they're not quite yet gone, but they know they're going. And it's extraordinarily difficult for all of us who've had parents go through that. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, I don't know, the difficulty of articulating relationship when there's a lyric I who speaks the poem.
Yeah, I think it's one of my subjects, you know, relationship, kind of both in defining myself apart from relationship and then understanding my place within relationship. I think of my poetry as kind of myself probing whatever my attention is on. And sometimes, you know, it's a fountain, or sometimes it's a tree, and sometimes it's the people to their chagrin nearest me. I don't really know how to talk about it, except for this doesn't have anything, but my book, Beauty Refracted, has a lot of a daughter in it. And it is, and I noticed, I think Tina mentioned this, it seems so important to write from my perspective about, I was writing about things that maybe she was going through, but I was writing from my perspective. And I found it kind of a tightrope. And I think it always can be a tightrope. And in terms of my mother, that first poem, Arthritis, you know, really is somewhat separate from the series of poems I'm writing about that, you know, as you say, sort of slippage away. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult to witness and to know how to write about, and then to put aside, say, what you thought were your issues with a parent, you know, and then to say, well, you know, that's nothing compared to, it's all a balancing act for me.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. I mean, extraordinarily so, isn't it? And so beautifully done. And I was thinking back to Didi's poem about her second husband's suicide, and
Yes.
that sense of how you speak for the other, really, and you keep a distance and you don't keep a distance. And
yeah. In my case, I don't think I ever think of myself as speaking for the other. It's more my perception, you know, on, you know, it can be a landscape, it can be a situation, it can be, you know, anything, but it's, yeah, I don't think of myself as attempting to speak for others.
I loved that you started with landscape poems too, that, you know, you showed us that range, but also, you know, that just, you know, I think that kind of bearing witness is incredibly important too, particularly at this time in the history of the world.
I do too. I'm not sure it's as valued as much right now, but I think
there's a terrible sense that it's, I mean, I don't know how it is over there, but here there's a tremendous still temptation to dismiss it as somehow pastoral, when actually that kind of radical attention is the most necessary discipline for all of us, including if we live in cities. I
agree. Yeah. Thank you.
And Arthur does it too, of course, but, you know.
Yes, let's just bring it in.
On a humorous note, because I was picking up a lot of your marriage poems, or at least poems to Arthur, or at least reference to Arthur.
I think there's really, just one in here.
That raccoon poem, which is the raccoon is so cute. Yeah, also, did he really go back and turn off the tap?
It was so long ago.
But you know, even though the poem is not meant for Arthur, but arthritis, I thought, you know, I don't know whether you're punning on his name, Arthur.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear what you said.
The poem Arthritis.
No, of course not. Arthritis is part of my life. And it has nothing to do with him. I mean,
no, it doesn't matter, but I think it just adds a humorous tone.
You know, our writing lives are very separate. We're good readers for each other's work, but no.
Yes, clearly. I mean, one of my favorite books is this one. I think one of your early books, Chalk Marks on Stone. And when I read that and reread that, and, you know, you clearly at that phase, you were very much, I wouldn't say influenced, certainly influence would be one word, the whole Chinese construct of poetry and hexagrams in particular. And talk about the form, because, you know, there's a lot of intensity when it comes to architectural aspects of your poetry. You know, there's couplets, there's terces, but, you know, even otherwise, your long sequences are very, very tightly wrought, and they've got an intricate sort of mathematical pattern. We haven't talked about that aspect of poetry. Perhaps you could talk about that, because it's very much there in your poetry.
I'd love to. And you were referencing another part of the field, which I wrote, and actually predates Arthur, just so you know. I wrote in, after I knew the I Ching very well, and I started tossing the coins, and decided I wanted to write, you know, you use 3 coins and there's 6 lines, the hexagrams. And so I wrote 3-syllable lines, and each poem was 3, you know, each line was 3 syllables, and each poem was 6 lines. And that kind of formal equivalence, it is something that interests me. In my long sequence, The Lightning Field, you know, when I went to the Walter de Maria, the lightning field in central New Mexico, which is a mile by a kilometer of these lightning poles, I felt the same way. I wanted each line to be the equivalent of a pole. I wanted each line to attract lightning the way a lightning pole does. And so the poles were, the field is 16 poles by 25. And that was the first thing I knew, that I was going to write a poem that would, a sequence of 16 poems, each 25 lines. And that isn't enough to write a poem, but it is enough to sort of get me curious and get me motivated for some reason. I had, you know, in college, I studied prosody with Robert Fitzgerald, as did other people in the audience. And I always think of prosody as meter, as a backbone, as something I hear and I'm attentive to and I care about, even though many of my poems, you know, aren't metered per se. I'm aware of how the beats run. I care a lot about the music in poetry, the way sound and sense combine and just heighten each other.
That's the most archaic form of magic in a way, isn't it? That sense of the sound and the sense.
It is kind of, it's often, it's not always a starting point, but until I feel the form, the shape of a poem, and I mean, it could just be a 1 stanza poem, or it could be stanzas that are different line lengths, but until I feel it, I can't proceed very well. I have to, it kind of has, that's how it catches for me.
But your poems visually are very regular in terms of, you know, line lengths, and even if the poems are short, everything is short. I mean, it's very symmetrical in that sense.
I'm actually trying to do some that aren't. I feel like perhaps there's a little bit of a compulsiveness to that.
Obsession.
That, you know. But yeah, I care how they look on the page, and not that poems with lines, you know, with the widely different lengths don't look well on the page, but I am doing a little more of that recently, not that I read today.
But also there's that creative force of sorry. Also there's that creative energy which comes from using form, isn't it? Isn't there? Even, you know, a private form, a kind of concealed form, it produces different decisions. It turns the poem in ways you don't expect. I mean, as Tina was saying about Didi's line breaks, you know, that kind of geeky desire to see each other's commas and enjambments and so on, that, you know, every line turns a poem. I mean, just as in full rhymed poems, you know, every rhyme turns a poem, particularly in English, which is such a intractable language, because so intractable perversely because polymorphous, because it's got this vast vocabulary, apparent synonyms, and yet it's so difficult to harness into music.
Yeah, I know, I agree. And I think that sometimes, you know, having something you're wrangling with formally, and as you say, often a private formal problem, it can free the censor. I mean, it occupies the censor. And so then unexpected things come.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Of white noise. Maybe we should bring Didi and Tina in and ask perhaps if either of you would like to, you know, confess your formal relationship, formal obsessions. I mean, Didi, does any of this strike a bell for you?
I don't write in form traditionally. I am teaching a class of form right now, a workshop where we're writing in form. And then form, I guess, you know, it's true. It's like form is, you know, there's rhyme and meter, you know, we think of form, and then form, there's other ways in which we can think of form too. But one of the things that my students are finding, and I think that I'm finding as well, is it's not just, you know, maybe necessarily what the sound is going to be at the end and how that decision is going to like inform, if you will, the moves we make in our poems, but also in forms like the pantoum, for instance, that repetition of line, a lot of my students found that the narrative moves, you know, like 2 or 3 steps forward and then 2 steps back and then a few more steps forward and then a few steps back. And so that also plays into the decisions of what the poem is going to be about and such. So that's just some discoveries that we've been making just kind of even recently.
Yeah, joyous. Like the way a villanelle is such a great form for portraying the obsessive nature of romantic love. Let's come around again. And again.
Right.
Finally reunite the couplet. Very you know, romantic.
Yes, and I think that when you ask that question, I think to all of us, it's almost like, you know, that question of what were you wearing from like the 1960s till now, because it makes me think of all these different phases of my life and what I was interested in poetry at the time. I tell my students, and it was inspired by a visitor who came to our class who said, I think the perfect line or set of lines is the couplet. You know, that's how I wrote my book, is in the couplet. And I said, oh gosh, you know, when I was first starting to write, I was obsessed with the tercet. You know, again, this kind of like this geeky conversation that you start to have. I said, okay, why the tercet? The tercet to me, instead of standing on 2 legs, it's standing on 3 legs, and how much more secure that is. And then moving forward. And Didi, I'm teaching a class on forms. And I love it when we get to this place where we start even talking about erasure, and we start talking about the Zuhitsu. You know, we were talking about the feminine, like at the beginning of the conversation. It had a lot to do with apology, and I started becoming very involved in the Zuhitsu. I'm sure there's someone out there who I could have a very, you know, in-depth conversation about the Zuhitsu, and that was essentially a female form. You know, this is a female, you know, think about female empowerment. The Japanese courtesans were writing in the Zuhitsu, which is derived from the Pillow Book, the sense of dream and dreaming, the subconscious, and how that sort of moved forward into the present day Zuhitsu. And now that I've taught the Zuhitsu to you know, Western students, it's amazing to see this Eastern form now placed in the hands of my students who are in the West, and what they do with it is so exciting for me, you know, to see how they can move the form forward. Yeah.
It's a bit like what, say, an Indian poet who's very well known in America, Agha Shahid Ali, did with the ghazal form.
Yeah.
You know, the ghazal originated, you know, in
Mimi Kavati here, who's an Iranian British poet.
The American.
I often tell my students that Shahid would be very upset with some of the ways that they're handling the ghazals, you know, handling it. You know, because if the pattern even falls off, he was not invested or interested in that at all. You had to stay true to the form, and you'll see a lot of people taking a lot of liberties with that form too. Well, I don't have to repeat that word, or I don't have to rhyme in that way, and so then the form starts to change. So this is a whole other conversation, is that what liberties can we take with traditional forms?
Well, that's certainly something that goes on with a sonnet all the time. You know, is it going to be rhymed? Is it even going to be 14 lines? Is it really, you know, iambic pentameter?
Absolutely. Does it have to have a 5th line?
Yeah. So I think it happens with all forms, and it's kind
and
of
if it's still a sonnet, is it still a sonnet if you make all of those changes, or is it a 14-line poem?
It's kind of like a translation. Is it a translation, or is it inspired by? And in some ways, if it's a poem that we care about rereading, I don't particularly think it really matters. I don't think of my sense myself as a formal poet in the traditional sense of the word of a formal poet. I think poetry.
But do you think that those forms, the traces of the forms, are there as an illusion, in the same way as, you know, using a plant from a particular place, or the proper name of a particular person, or, you know, a phrase that comes from a famous poem? I mean, aren't they, even if a sonnet is no longer a sonnet, it's gone, you know, it's not a sonnet or bust, is it? It can be a trace of a sonnet. It can be alluding to a sonnet, it can be carrying some extra resonance. So
I think so. Yeah.
You're nodding away, Didi.
One of the poems, Tina, you read, the Revolutionary Kiss. I mean, even though it's a prose poem, and and we are talking about, fabulously nerdy things like line breaks and commas, and love it. I love it. I love it. I'm so happy that we're talking about it. But, when you put it in the chat box on the side, depending on my chat box is probably narrower than someone else's computer, which is a wider screen.
Right.
And the lines are breaking in a different place.
Right.
For me, at the same time, you're visually looking at it differently. But your revolutionary case, even though it's a prose poem, it's densely musical and also very visceral. And for that to happen, you're using particular kinds of components of rhymes and rhymes, clearly, in the poem. So
And
there's
that's
that
the hardest
too.
thing to teach. Right now I am up to the prose poem with my students, and they're having a very, very difficult time. For anybody who could have this conversation, I could have it forever. How do you maintain the music when you're writing in long lines, where you're not in jamming? So these are all constant conversations in my class. So thank you for saying that, because, in so many ways, I want to teach my poem, and I never do. I want to teach my poem only to say, well, this is how I thought of music. There's so many other examples too. How do you maintain the long line that stretches completely off the page, that only breaks itself because it's the end of the page, but still maintain lyricism? This is, and then you referred to a lot of the methods and ways
Of
that
course,
poets.
C.S. Williams, and he'll turn the book around and make sure
C.K.
his long
yeah.
lines. C.K. Williams, yes, yeah.
Didi, you were saying that you're also teaching. You've also got a prose poetry. It must be that
We're going
moment
to be
of-
talking. Yeah, I was going to say we're going to be talking about the prose poem actually today. We're going to just be finishing odes, and then we're moving to the prose poem, which I'm teaching AstroTurf, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
Kind
yeah.
of you. Thank you.
Poem. So that's what we'll be talking about later this afternoon. The group that was in the reading today was it's a first year writing seminar, and it's a class about women poets in America. But the later one's in a workshop that we'll be doing prose. It's so funny that I don't know. I worked with sonnets and things that are a little more tight in their form, and then trying to open up as the semester goes a little bit, and that's why I think prose poems are kind of coming into play now. Yeah.
Carol, do you teach?
I teach privately. I have a small handful of private students. Yeah.
There's this wonderful book, Didi, and I hope everybody knows about it. It was a series. It's called The International Prose Poem. And that was a book that I brought into my students because it was a journal that was out for quite a while. And, those days when I had all the time in the world to dig around in bookstores, I found one, and it was sort of like the best of the international prose poem. And I was so excited that I found it. If I find an extra copy, I'll find a way to send it to you. But I find that book is a really great sort of foundation to talk about the prose poem, because I find it particularly, out of all the forms that we're looking at, is particularly difficult to teach, and utilizing a lot of the methods that Sudeep was mentioning, like repetition, off rhymes. I mean, they're like, how do I hear it? If the line is going completely across the page, how do I hear it? When so much of the time I ask them to count syllables, when I'm asking them to look at sort of the formation on the page, that I think is sometimes the hardest lesson to teach, how to hear them.
The best. Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay, no, Carol.
I was saying that I think one of the best things is to just read aloud.
Absolutely.
And,
There's a great international prose poem anthology just published by the Australian ANU, Australian National University at Canberra. They have a great creative writing team there, and it's really good. International anthology, just out. I can't remember what it's called, but if you Google it,
let us know if you. I would love to know.
It's just that in fact, Fiona, it's funny. I was thinking about exactly the same, because it's just out. I don't have a copy of it yet.
Yeah, I'm just wondering actually whether I've got a link to it. Probably not.
But they've also, that same team have also produced a wonderful sort of a primer to prose poetry, which is published by Princeton University Press. It's called, I'm forgetting the name, but I'm happy to send you the link as well. But I think it's 10 o'clock, which we've done really well for time. Fiona, I think we should pat each other's back, because normally we go way over time.
Yes, but it's partly because we've had 3 very disciplined readers this time, who have all been sticking to their time.
Everybody kept to their time, which makes it's so much easier for us to have this long conversation. But it's been a super, super treat as always.
Yes, it's been a
Thank you,
joy. Thank you. All
Didi,
Thank you.
Tina, Carol, Fiona, Dawn,
Thank you,
it's-
Sudeep. Thank you,
And
everybody. It's been great as
wonderful,
ever.
wonderful.
Yes,
Thank
wonderful.
you. Thank you so
Till the
much.
next time.
What
Till
a
next
Till
pleasure.
month.
next time.
Thanks so
Okay.
much.
All
Yeah.
right.
Next month.
Thank you.
Bye.
Next
Thank
month,
you.
Tuesday, same time. We'll see you again.
Great.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Bye.